I'm afraid many in the Arab press have been misconstruing things and inflaming things. All we ask is that we get a fair hearing, that they look at the facts and they not jump to conclusions. Richard Boucher, US State Department.
Welcome back to Inside Iraq. We are discussing how the West and the Arab media look at Iraq. Do they reach different conclusion or the same conclusion with Jihad al-Khazin, Ann Nelson and Jamal Khashoggi? We covered before the invasion Jihad al-Khazin. Now we are talking about the post-invasion. Has the coverage improved, whether in the Western cap or the Arab cap? Did they learn the lesson of the before the invasion and now we are getting actual real picture of Baghdad and Iraq?
I think we did not get a real picture of Iraq for months. Remember the embedded journalists who were only fed the information that the occupying forces gave them. On the Arab side, we all became more interested. We tried to send journalists there. Once we realized that it's going to be a long haul, they are not going to go walk in and walk out, we became more interested. But it took months, to tell you honestly. And at the beginning, the Arab coverage of the war was lacking.
But Jamal, is the objectivity on the depth of the coverage increased since 2003? Meaning to say, they look at the same issue and they reach the real fact. Let's just take, for instance, the surge that has been in the news for quite some time. In the West, everybody agrees, whether politicians or in the media, that the surge achieved a great deal of stability, perhaps with a view of allowing national reconciliation in Iraq. How do the Arabs look at the surge? Did it succeed, or was it basically succeed from American perspective, that is the lowering the American casualty?
There's two angles the Americans look at Iraq from their point of view, from the surge, from the American troops, the present, the success, the failures, while the Arabic media concentrate more on the internal affair of Iraq, how the Iraqis are reacting to the surge, how the Iraqis are reacting to the Americans pulling out of central Iraq or attacking Fallujah or vice versa. So we were more interested in getting reactions from Iraqi government or opposition or even resistant.
Has the coverage and the depth and the analysis improved in light of the problems before?
Well, again, first of all, I think that there's much more variation to the U.S. coverage than you're implying. There is a press that is very critical and has been from the beginning. You have The Nation, for example, which was never in favor of the war and has been quite vocal in calling up all of these critiques. That has continued. And at this point, you would find many, many journalists and many publications questioning the surge. And I also find that there's a real effort to report on Iraqi casualties and the suffering of the Iraqis in this war. It is technically the most difficult war to report in anybody's memory, simply because when journalists of any nation leave the green zone, their lives are at stake. And so that has made it very, very difficult. People want to, and I would point also to the New Yorker magazine. I think Seymour Hersh, John Lee Anderson have done their very best to report the complexity of this story with full acknowledgement of the rights and the sufferings of the Arabs.
When it comes to the coverage of Iraq in the Arab world, do reporters and editors-in-chief and head of news organization take into consideration how their national government look at Iraq and consequently try to reflect that? Or do they take it, this is an Arab country, and they reported it the way it is? To what extent internal politics affect the reporting?
I honestly believe the governments were not part of the coverage. We were covering it as an Arab country under occupation. There were biases, especially when when you look at a conflict between the Shia and Sunni. A Sunni will side with the Sunnis, a Shia will side with the Shia. There is no doubt about that.
And whether the current government is a lackey of Iran or not, or whether they toe the American line or not.
There are people who would justify the increasing influence of Iran in Iraq because they are Shiites, whereas there are Sunnis who are completely opposed to that on religious basis more than anything else. We try to cover the news as it is. I found it distressing talking about the surge and the improvement that it brought.
Why?
Because it did bring a relative improvement in security. But so 100 people are not being killed every day in Iraq. 30 people are killed. But is 30 people being killed justified? This is what's happening now.
Does that get a coverage in the U.S., what Jihad just said?
It does, and the New York Times has been much more active in covering these issues to the extent they can. There's another element I'd like to throw out, which is that over the last 5 years, the major news organizations have been scrambling desperately to get Arabic speakers on their staffs, and it's been quite difficult. They've been sending people back to school to study language. And, you know, our country was and continues to be ignorant of many of the basic issues. There's a steep learning curve.
Does that apply to the media?
Yes, absolutely.
Was it a learning curve they are trying to achieve?
Well, let me put it this way. How many Arabic reporters do you see on the U.S. networks? You know, we have a cultural gap here, and I think that there are a lot of people who are trying to overcome it, but it's taking time, and we don't really have time in this situation.
Going back to whether the Arab media, with the way they cover it, they take into consideration their national interest. You are an editor-in-chief of Al-Watan Al-Arabi. When you write about Iraq, or when your reporters write about Iraq, do you lift your finger and say, how is my Saudi government looked at this? How is this affecting the balance between the Sunnis and the Shiites in the kingdom?
Very much, very much. A couple of weeks ago, when the Iraqi troops were storming Basra and battling Sadr al-Mahdi army, we had a headline in Al-Watan newspaper, my newspaper, the Shia battles between the Shia is intensifying in the south of Iraq. I received a telephone call from a Saudi Shia who complained, and he suggested that our headline had a sectarian twist to it, to mention that the Shias are killing each other right now. So we take into consideration those kind of matters. الشرق الأوسط, another London-based newspaper which print in Iraq, I was told once by their editor-in-chief, who's a good friend of mine, that they take in consideration not to find themselves in the middle of sectarian issues between the Shias themselves, or the Shias or the Sunnis, because they have a larger presence in Iraq and they print in Iraq. We don't. But we have to take into consideration local issues. I objected very much to a headline in another local Saudi newspaper where they had in the headline that the Sunnis are going through a massacre. Sunnis are being massacred in Iraq, and I objected to that headline. It was unobjective, and it could affect our local sensitivities.
Looking back at the event after 5 years, let's just suppose, for the sake of argument, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Christian Science Monitor, the Los Angeles Times, they all came out before the war and said, stop it, don't do it, this is a big mistake. Do you think the administration would have heeded that call, or would they have proceeded regardless?
There still is a war party in that administration.
You're talking about the Vulcans, Cheney and Wolf?
Yeah, Vice President Cheney in his office, neocons in and around the administration. To answer the question, I think they would have still gone to war. But at least, you know, the press would have enough leverage then after the war to
say, I told you so.
Maybe to pull out or to seek a solution, not to have an open-ended war and open-ended presence in Iraq. You know, Iraq is a big Arab country. I don't think the average Iraqi will want to have the Americans in his country for the next 10 or 20 years. But look at the bases they are building. They're not
Jamal
building bases
Khashoggi, quickly, you lived in Washington recently after the war, and you are a media savvy and you're editor-in-chief. Was there some sort of a regret, you know, percolating through the Washington Post, New York Times, for perhaps the minor disservice they played in not being vigilant enough?
Well, they were critical of the war. They were not.
They actually reviewed their own editorials.
Yes, they are. But with the whole experience and knowledge, they haven't begun to understand the Arab mind, that the Arab mind doesn't accept foreign presence. And that's applied also to Afghanistan. There is a great amount of hate, inherited differences between the Arabs' Muslim mind and the former past of Christendom, the Crusade and etc. That should have been analyzed before they got to the war, and it should be analyzed now to pull out of the war.
You use the word analysis. Will there be post-mortem analysis, and quickly?
There's continual post-mortem analysis, and it's going on in the journalism reviews and the magazines. But the other thing to understand about the U.S. press is that it doesn't see itself as an activist press. It has never said, we are going to stop a war. They say, we cover the political events of this country. So they didn't try to stop Vietnam. Once Vietnam turned into a big mess, they criticized what was happening. So maybe the U.S. press will have to analyze its own role in society more.
Ann Nelson of the Columbia University, thank you very much. Jamal Khashoggi, editor-in-chief of Al Watan, journalist and columnist Jihad Al-Khazin, thank you for being guests on Inside Iraq.
Thank you.
To access the show and to send us your comments, please go to aljazeera.net/English. That's all the time we have for this week from Dubai. Join me next week when we take another look inside Iraq.